This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? It's a question that scholars and everyday people have wrestled with for centuries.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
Hear his word, Rameses, and obey.
Charlton Heston says that he was Ramses. In one of the biggest blockbusters of all time, Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. The Pharaoh's name isn't specifically listed in the Bible, but the name Ramses is mentioned. In Genesis 47, it says that Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. And then hundreds of years later, it says in the first chapter of Exodus, it says that the Israelites were made slaves and were oppressed, and they were forced to build Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. So to help answer the question of who was the Pharaoh, Henry Smith had a chat with Dr. Doug Petrovich. He's a professor of biblical history and exegesis, and he's the author of the book Origins of the Hebrews, New Evidence of Israelites in Egypt from Joseph to the Exodus. Here's Henry.
Doug, welcome to Digging for Truth. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Henry. It's great to be with you here today.
Well, we're excited to have you on the program for the first time, and we hope to do more with you and draw on your expertise. Now, speaking of that, since you are coming on for the first time, what I always like to do is give our guests a chance to tell the audience a little bit of their backstory so they get to know you a little bit. So I'd like you to do that. Could you share with the audience for a little bit, give them a brief bio of your background and your passions?
Sure, Henry. Definitely, my passion is walking with the Lord. I mean, that's number one, and loving all of God's people and building into them through discipleship. So that's pretty much, the heart and soul of who I am. And God's really guided me into this area of biblical history and biblical archaeology, which has become just a great area of passion, and I've loved to learn everything I have, and really it's exciting because I'm constantly realizing how little I know, and so I'm trying to learn more all the time. But I received a Bachelor of Arts degree at the Moody Bible Institute in evangelism, and then after that I did a Master of Theology and a Master of Divinity at the Master's Seminary, which is in Southern California. And then after teaching for 10 years, we built a seminary from scratch in Siberia, Russia. And in those 10 years, we then trained the people who took it over for us. So now they're teaching and administrating where we were before. And so that freed me up to come back to the Northern Hemisphere. So I went to Toronto and I did an MA and a PhD. My area of major in my PhD is Syro-Palestinian archaeology. And then I have a first minor in ancient Egyptian language, so that you would know that as hieroglyphics, so that's Middle and Late Egyptian. And then my second minor is in ancient Near Eastern religions.
Well, that's wonderful, and we should tell the audience that you and I met each other in Israel at the Hatzor excavations in 2007. And so that is our connection, goes all the way back to that period of time. So as part of your story, God exiled you to Siberia, huh? So you had to learn how to speak Russian.
Exactly. And, I was also asked not only to start to launch the seminary where I was academic dean and I taught, but I was asked to be a church planting pastor. So I had to learn Russian quickly so that I could get to the place where I could preach on my own. So by the time I left, I was excited that I was actually preaching right into Russian with my Greek Bible in my hands, going straight from Greek to Russian with no helps in any of the other languages. So that was pretty much the greatest thrill I had over there.
Yeah, I bet. Well, I can certainly say you're a better man than me when it comes to that. That is fantastic. Well, one of your passions over the years is obviously your minor in Egyptology and in terms of studying the hieroglyphic language is this question of the Exodus and the Exodus Pharaoh in particular. Now, You and I agree, and the Ministry of ABR and you agree that the date of the Exodus should be 1446 BC, and we've laid that out in other episodes. But what we want to do is situate that date in Egyptian history. This is called the New Kingdom period, and specifically the 18th dynasty. You know, why don't we set the stage a little bit for what's happening in that time period leading up to the events of the Exodus?
Sure, Henry. But let's start a little bit earlier, a lot earlier, in the 12th dynasty of Egypt. That's the dynasty that's connected to Joseph. And all of this is in my new book called Origins of the Hebrews, New Evidence for Israelites in Egypt, from Joseph to the Exodus. And there I build the case for the occupation that the Israelites had there in Egypt in the Nile Delta at a site called Avaris. And I'm not the first to connect Israelites to Avaris. There are many people, Bryant Wood included, in that line who make that connection. But what happened in the 12th dynasty in Joseph's day is that there was this increase in the size of the Israelites. And they were engaged in a couple of industries. One was a turquoise mining industry down in Sinai. That's one. But the one that really became the staple for them, believe it or not, whether you like it or not, whether I like it or not, is a lucrative trading industry with wine. So wine that was made in Canaan was exported in large jars called Canaanite jars and sent to Avaris, where it was distributed throughout Egypt. So the Israelites essentially became middlemen. They became players in this trade. And obviously that it would have been extremely lucrative for them, especially when we realized that Manfred Betock, who was for over 40 years, the chief excavator at Avaris, he concluded that in the time of the second millennium BC, when this trade went on between Avaris and Canaan, over 2 million jars, 2 million Canaanite jars, found their way into Avaris and were dispersed, which means 14 jars per day were coming in. So this is the industry that God allowed the Israelites to participate in, which really made them big players in the ancient world, and especially in Egypt.
And it sounds like a thriving group of people during this time until we get to the events that are recorded in the book of Exodus. Maybe you could set the stage for that, if you would, please.
Sure. In about 1668 or BC or so, the Hyksos came in to Avaris, and they lived among the Israelites, and they essentially were Asiatics who were more warring people than the Israelites. The Israelites were just very domesticated and not really interested in warfare. The Hyksos came. They lived there for about 108 years, according to the ancient Egyptian records. And during that time, they probably had a very good relationship with the Israelites. And then there's this Pharaoh that we read about in Exodus 1 called the Pharaoh who did not know of Joseph. And that almost certainly was a man named Amenhotep. He was the last king of Dynasty 17, the first king of Dynasty 18. And what he did is he moved his troops from southern Egypt, which is the higher half of Egypt, downward or northward into the Nile Delta. And they invaded and they pushed back the Hyksos all the way to Avaris and basically eventually eliminated their kingdom and chased them out. And the remnants of the Hyksos moved to Canaan, and they lived there for 3 years. And it's during this moment that the Pharaoh who does not know of Joseph says that we need to do something with these Israelites lest they join themselves to our enemies and come and attack us. So the fear was that the Israelites would leave Egypt, go to Canaan, join up with the Asiatic Hyksos there, and then come back and attack. So it was at that time, in about 1560 BC, when the Hyksos were chased out and the Israelites were put into bondage, which means that it was about 114 years of slavery out of the 430 years that they were there. So this oppression began under Amos's reign, but during the time that he became what we know of now as the first king of the 18th dynasty. So same king, and there's just this easy transition from dynasty 17 to 18. And that's when the oppression started for the Israelites. Okay, very good. And that again is that reference you brought up in the first chapter of Exodus, a Pharaoh who did not know of Joseph. This is the one you're identifying with that. It's just to make sure I have that correct. That's absolutely right.
Okay, so that fits one of the criteria that we have to talk about, because there's a lot of criteria to find the Pharaoh of the Exodus. That's one of them. You want to find out who that is. Another, criteria that we have to deal with is sort of how the Pharaoh fits with the life of Moses. We know that he murdered an Egyptian at the age of 40 and took off for Midian. So let's talk about that a little bit and just share your insights, please.
Sure, Henry. He had to be the father or the predecessor. It didn't have to be the father, but the predecessor of the Exodus Pharaoh had to have a long reign, and he was reigning while Moses was exiled in Midian for over 40 years. So Moses fled from this unnamed Pharaoh who sought to execute him for killing an Egyptian, and we know that according to Exodus 2, departing from Egypt when Moses was fulfilling 40 years of age, according to Acts 7:23. Well, only after 40 years had passed, according to Acts 7:30, did the burning bush incident occur, which was immediately following the statement that in the course of those many days, the king of Egypt died. And we find that in Exodus 2:23. So what does that all add up to? How does the math work? Well, Moses died when he was 120 years old, according to Deuteronomy 34. Therefore, according to Moses' biography, the Pharaoh who preceded the Exodus Pharaoh must have ruled beyond 40 years. And there are only two candidates within dynasties 18 and 19 who fit this bill. One of them is Thutmose III, as the predecessor to the Exodus Pharaoh. The other is Rameses II. So only these two men fit this biblical requirement.
Yeah, and it seems very logical to me from reading the text that's right on the money. We believe the Bible is the Word of God, and therefore that is our guide into leading us who the Exodus Pharaoh is. So let's talk about Thutmose III a little bit, since he was so important in this time.
Sure. And Thutmose III, he was he was called the Napoleon of Egypt by many modern scholars. It's because during his reign, he launched 17 military campaigns into the Levant, and the land of Israel is part of the Levant. It's the southern Levant. So during these campaigns, he was attacking cities and overcoming city-states and kings that were there. But he was pushing all the way against the borders of his ancient rival, Mitanni. So there were two superpowers of the day, Mitanni and Egypt. And he demonstrated during these 17 campaigns that he was the greater of the two superpowers. It's kind of like the U.S. and Russia or the Soviet Union back in the day. They were competing with one another to be the greater superpower. And Egypt was the greater superpower. We know this from the campaign that he launched in his 33rd year when he went into Mitanni's territory. He went all the way to the Euphrates River, and he took his forces down the Euphrates River, sacking and burning cities along the way. And he demonstrated that Egypt was the most powerful ancient empire.
That certainly fits the bill, and not only in terms of the chronology that you laid out, but just the general sense you get from the text of what's happening in Egypt during that time period. Now, another piece of criteria that we have, and you could just lay this out a little bit, is the fact that the firstborn son of the Pharaoh has to die. So we have that issue. So whoever we identify as the Exodus Pharaoh, his firstborn son cannot assume the throne because he's dead from the Exodus.
Yeah, and the firstborn son of Amenhotep II, as far as we know, he never gets onto the throne. So who is the eldest son? Well, the Egyptians, they were very careful about documenting things. And one of the things that they did is they made sure to list whoever was the king's eldest son. So this was a very important term. And Thutmose IV, who is the pharaoh that followed Amenhotep II, he never claimed to be the king's eldest son. And we know from an inscription that's on the paws of the Sphinx that he never had that distinction. And no other document throughout Egypt's history shows that he has made such a claim. There's one possibility that exists for the oldest son of Amenhotep II, and that is that he was a man named Thutmose. And a renowned Egyptologist named Donald Redford has suggested that probably this Thutmose died in infancy, which would, of course, fit the biblical description perfectly because he never rises to such a position. But there is a statement made that a certain tutor of a man named Thutmose claims to be the tutor of the king's eldest son, and so probably this is the Thutmose that is the child who died at the time of the 10th plague on Egypt.
Well, that's excellent. Let's talk about it a little bit further, this inscription that you mentioned about the Sphinx and so on. I'll let you run with that.
Yeah, so this is called the Dream Stela, and it's located between the paws of the Sphinx, and it very clearly makes the argument, well, first of all, it describes who Thutmose IV was, and makes it clear that he was not the king's eldest son. So that important title that this pharaoh, this firstborn son of Egypt's pharaoh would always take for himself, that title was one that was never included. But yeah, there is the statement in Exodus 4:22 where it says, "I will kill your son, your firstborn." So according to this verse, the king's eldest son had to die during this 10th plague on Egypt, when this destroyer came to kill the firstborn of every person and every domesticated animal throughout Egypt, from the king on the throne all the way down to the prisoner in the jail.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. It's sobering, but again, the trail of evidence and the work that you've done in investigating this really makes Amenhotep II, he fits the bill here. The son, his successor, Thutmose IV, not his firstborn son, and so on. Okay, so now in terms of the Red Sea incident that occurs, a lot of people have the perception that the Pharaoh dies in the Red Sea. In fact, the old movie, The Ten Commandments, they actually get it right. Rameses goes back to his capital. Wrong Pharaoh, but he went back. He didn't drown in the sea.
Right.
Your argument is that the biblical text actually doesn't say that, and I'd like you to share that with the audience to look carefully at the text. Please do that, Doug.
Sure. So it kind of works like this, Henry. Like most of you, I'm guessing, or many of you, you learned as a child in Sunday school that the Pharaoh died with his army in the Red Sea. But ultimately, when I realized that Amenhotep II lived beyond 1446 BC, which is the year of the Exodus, he lived long beyond it. He lived into at least his 26th year, and I accept the argumentation that he lived into into the 30s. So it was beyond 30 years, well beyond 30 years. What do you do with the text then? If he lives this long, does he really die? So being that, of course, I'm a teacher of Hebrew language, ancient Hebrew Bible, I decided I'm going to look at this more carefully. So I looked at some of the passages that talk about this. For example, Psalm 106:11, where it reads, "Then the water covered their adversaries, not one of them remained." So according to many people, allegedly Pharaoh, as the chief adversary, was among the slain Egyptians who died in this debacle in the water. But if Amenhotep II actually was the Exodus Pharaoh, then his reign would have ended abruptly during the year of the Exodus, or 1446.
Right.
But really, Psalm 106:11 never specifically mentions Pharaoh. So there's no reason to conclude that he drowned with his army. Only those Egyptian adversaries, as national representatives, who chased the Israelites into the sea, were consumed by the water. And since they were the task force dispatched on this mission, their defeat signals the demise of the entire nation. So we can understand the verse in that light.
Yeah, it's very helpful. And the other verse is Psalm 136:15. And here you know, an article that you wrote years ago, you really do great work on explaining this to the reader. When I read through that, it just totally convinced me of your argument. But I'd like you to explain that instead of me doing that.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite verses to address, Henry. And of course, it's not a firsthand witness, right? The firsthand witness is Exodus 14:28 and that context. And it never says there that the Pharaoh died in the sea with his army. But the proof text that's used is Psalm 136:15, where it says, "But he overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Sea of Reeds." for his steadfast love endures forever. So literally, the term there for overthrew is not actually overthrowing like destroying or killing. It's he shook off. So the Hebrew verb actually states that God shook off the powerful Pharaoh and his army, who were like bothersome pests that God, decided need to just be brushed away. And that same Hebrew verb is used in Psalm 109:23, where it says, where David actually laments, he says, I am gone like a shadow when it lengthens. I am shaken off like the locust. So here David's describing this sad condition of his suffering, right? The picture painted by the verb is that David had become like a locust that casually is flicked away from a person's garment. Well, David certainly was not describing his own demise or his death.
Yes.
So Psalm 136:15 does not teach that the Exodus Pharaoh died alongside his army. They were just flicked off like a locust from somebody's shoulder.
Yeah, like here's God and here's the Pharaoh kind of going like that. It's really an amazing picture. When I first read your article about that, I almost laughed because of the arrogance of man lifted up against the Lord God of the universe. Now, one of the things that you point to is the biography of Amenhotep II and this military campaign that he launches later of the same year as the Exodus. And I won't say any more because I want you to share with the audience what you know about this.
Sure. And this was an amazing set of like gold mines, like falling into gold mines, right? When I researched all of this and I realized how it fits so perfectly together with biblical history. So Amenhotep II launched 2 campaigns into Asia. We call these Asiatic campaigns. The first one was when his father died and the kings of the Levant rebelled against Egypt's authority because his father, Thutmose III, had them, under his thumb. So they rebelled. He went up into Canaan and all the way up into Syria, all the way to the border of Mitanni, his ancient rival, his superpower rival, and he fought back and he regained control of all of these city-states. And in these 17 campaigns that his father, that Amenhotep II's father, launched, Thutmose III, into the Levant, they always were gaining more territory. But Amenhotep II's second and final Asiatic campaign, in his year 7, which I'm equating to 1446 BC, it did not go further into the Levant. It did not go all the way up into Syria or all the way to the Euphrates River like his father did. Instead, it's what we would call a glorified slave raid. What does that mean? It means that if you look at the numbers recorded there, the booty list, what did he walk away from with this campaign? If you add up the numbers, it's over 100,000 slaves that he acquired. And what does that mean? Well, let's contrast it to the other campaigns of his first campaign, and then 3 of the campaigns that his father launched that give us a number. 46 times more slaves were taken by Amenhotep II in his second Asiatic campaign than all of those other recorded campaigns combined. That's staggering. Plus, this campaign was launched in November. This isn't the season that you launch a campaign if you're an ancient king. You launch your campaigns in the spring. It says in 1 Chronicles 20, then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that Joab led out the army and ravaged the land of the sons of Ammon, etc. So that's when battles take place. And that's true within all of the ancient world and all of the history that's been left behind. But this was a campaign in November, in the winter. Why would you launch it in November? Well, if you've just lost your slave base in April of that same year, you would be looking for slaves. And Henry, if you look at the numbers out of that 100,000 plus total of slaves that were taken in southern Canaan, in Canaan actually, in the southern Levant, 3,600 of them are called Apiru. This is the first mention of Apiru prisoners taken by Egyptians in all of Egypt's history. Again, if this is months after the Exodus and some number of the Israelites have left the base, right? Like we have Korah's rebellion and this attacks on Moses' leadership. Now you have Israelites very prone to walk away from Moses and to walk away from the body of the Israelites, wanting to have something for themselves. So we would think from history that they found their way. They separated from Moses. They found their way into Canaan. They settled down. And next thing you know, in November of that year, Pharaoh comes along and he sweeps up everyone he can to be his slaves, to take them down to Egypt. So this is some of the connection that you can see between his second Asiatic campaign and what we would expect to happen after this devastating time period in Egypt's history after the 10th plague and his army dies in the Sea of Reeds.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary, and you've laid this out from the evidence, and you're not saying anything that's not already in the academic material. It's there. This is what Amenhotep did. He captured 46 times as many slaves as his predecessor, his father, and himself. Yep. Right? Is that correct? So
that's right. 46 times more slaves.
You mentioned this group of 3,600 Abiru or Habiru that were captured by Amenhotep II in the fall campaign after the Exodus. Tell the audience what you see this connection with the Israelites and how that works in your thinking based on the evidence and the arguments.
Sure, and it all goes back to the statement that's made by Moses in the scripture when Abram is first introduced, and it says that Abram is a Hebrew. And that's fascinating because you think about the Hebrews and you think, well, don't the Hebrews start with Jacob and it's everybody in Jacob's family after that, and those are the Hebrews? But no, it says that Abram, who became Abraham, himself was a Hebrew. And so there's a term that's used in Akkadian, it's Habiru, and that translates into Middle Egyptian as Apiru, and it's the same word. No scholar disagrees that it's the same word. It's these ancient peoples who descend from somebody, and it's connected to this term Habiru. Well, it also says in the genealogy that's in Genesis, which you love so well, that the forefather of Abram is a guy named Aber, and Aber has all of the right consonants to fit this same term. So who was Abram? Abram was an Aberite. That's who he was. So from Aber descended numbers of peoples, and only one of that group of peoples found its way to a man named Abram. And so he was one of many Heberites or Eberites, however you want to term it. And so these people are found throughout the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, they're found in the 1700s BC, and they're not part of Abraham's family, but they're fellow Heberites. They're his relatives.
Yes.
So it's no surprise that Apiru are, part of these descendants who show up and are involved in what's going on in Egypt. And Henry, if you look at the Amarna letters that are composed by scribes under Akhenaten in the 14th century BC. Right, and this is before the late Exodus view and its time frame for the Exodus in the 13th century BC. So there are discussions that go on between the Pharaoh and the kings that are in these city-states in Canaan, and the city-states in Canaan are complaining because these people called the Habiru are attacking them over and over and over again. And the greatest king of all of the petty kings of Canaan, the only one who's actually called a king in the Amarna tablets, other than Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is the king of Hatzor, where you and I were digging in 2007. And that king was so powerful, he was called by his fellow Canaanite kings a true king. And what it says in the Amarna letters, as you walk through them, the ones that deal with Hatzor, it says that the allegiance of the king of Hatzor first was with the king of Egypt, and then over time, his allegiance moved toward these Habiru who kept attacking him. And think about this, Henry. Think about the logic. How would the greatest king of Canaan, who has the Egyptian king to rely on if he needs him, how would that king give himself over to the power of these Habiru if they're only what scholars today call marauders? They're bandits. That's what scholars are telling us.
Yes.
That the Habiru are bandits. That just can't be the case. Why? Because 3,600 of them were captured by the king of Egypt in one place and brought back as slaves. What king would capture 3,600 thieves. That would be stupid. Number two, when in history do you ever have 3,600 thieves assembling themselves together and working as a close-knit unit? It does not happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of logic to that argument, and I'll tell you, I think that needs to be taken much more seriously. And of course, the liberal scholars, critical scholars, they dismiss the Exodus, so they try to break this connection that you're making there. But I think there's a lot to be said for it. I wish we could talk about it more, Doug, but we do need to move to our next sort of identifying piece of information. We're going to shift back a little bit and talk about Moses when he was a baby. He was put into the Nile River by the Pharaoh's daughter. And it's fascinating. Let's talk about her.
Sure. And the question comes, well, what's the name of this princess who was involved? Well, there's a woman who became a princess, who became a queen, who became a king, called Hatshepsut. She was the daughter of Thutmose I. And we already established that it was Thutmose I who is the king who initiated that edict, that decree that said all of the male children of the Hebrews were to be killed. So that being the case, Hatshepsut is one of his daughters. In fact, she's the only daughter of his through Queen Amosa, the main queen of Thutmose III. She's the only daughter who survives infancy, which is fascinating, especially because that oldest, that princess, she almost certainly had to had enough mental faculties to be able to give instructions when that reed basket was found. So you have to be old enough to be, a princess of age, to be able to understand these things and communicate to people so that things are happening like we read about in the biblical text. So Thutmose I had one other secondary wife, Mutnofret, but Mutnofret, as far as we know, she never bore a daughter, or if she did, that daughter is never attested in any kind of documents or records. So we have no reason to think that there's any legitimate chance that a daughter of hers, the secondary queen, would be the right candidate. So almost certainly Hatshepsut fits that bill perfectly.
That's very good. Now, for our audience, in terms of remembering who was the Pharaoh's daughter, we think it was, I learned this when I went to Egypt in 2005, Doug. It's Hatshepsut. You see, so Hatshepsut, you say Hatshepsut, I say Hatshepsut. But either way, this is a good way to remember the names. Now, Doug, we want to talk a little bit about a desecration campaign that occurs against her.
Okay, so there was a campaign that was waged to destroy every image of Hatshepsut and every written form that expresses her name in a cartouche, right? So, and that's important because for every person to live forever in the field of reeds, the body, image, or name of that person must survive on earth. So someone, Henry, had a really important reason to try to wipe her out from all history on earth.
Let's develop that a little bit more. Explain some of the theology and some of the evidence connected to that. It's really fascinating.
Sure. I mean, basically, if you look around ancient Egypt, and you can Google and find images of Hatshepsut where it shows that her face is carved out, her body is carved out, her name is carved out of cartouches. In some cases, other kings' names are put in place where her name was. So there was this amazing nationwide activity. This had to be instructed by the king, no doubt about it, to wipe out every image of Hatshepsut. And she, of course, was the co-ruler with Thutmose III in the early part of his reign. He was a boy, and so she was old enough to kind of run the country as an adoptive mother. And then he took over sole rule at a later time. But her image, it didn't start to be destroyed or desecrated in Egypt until, and we know this from the evidence, until 20 years after Thutmose III was the sole ruler of Egypt. So for the Egyptologists who say probably Thutmose III kind of felt this all of a sudden, after the fact, he was angry that there was a woman on the throne and he needed to, right the wrong. Then why did he wait 20 years to do this, right? So it doesn't make sense. Plus, all of the building projects that Hatshepsut began, he completed. And that's not what you do with somebody that you hate. you would never do that. You would maybe destroy them, or you would maybe
Yes.
Rebuild them in your name. That's not what happened. So anyway, this desecration happened, and here's the problem. If all memory of an individual were lost or destroyed, the spirit of that person, and we have an Egyptian word for that, it's the ka, it's the immaterial person. That immaterial person would also perish, initiating this much dreaded second death, which is a total obliteration from all that there, and there's no return from this. So if that's the case, who would want to obliterate her? Well, Thutmose III, again, makes no sense. But Amenhotep II, Henry, he makes great sense. Why? Because after he lost his army in the Sea of Reeds, imagine this, he comes back to Egypt, and how is he feeling? He lost his son, not just a son, his oldest son, who was going to be next on the throne. Every Egyptian family member and friend and citizen lost his or her firstborn, and all of their cattle and all of their other herds, they all lost their firstborn. And there are these dead people and dead animals all over Egypt. He lost his army, and he who was the world leader, right? He was the leader of the superpower government on the earth, the greater empire between them and Mitanni. What would he feel like? He would be devastated. So he issued this decree to have her image desecrated throughout Egypt, because he knew that she was the Egyptian adoptive mother of Moses. And without her, Moses never would have gone on to be the one to take the Israelites out of Egypt. Isn't that fascinating?
It is. It's beyond fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating parts of the subject. It takes a little bit of inference to connect it up, but there really isn't a lot of other explanation. And you think about the rage Amenhotep II would have felt. If this foolish woman hadn't plucked this baby out of the river, we wouldn't have been in this disaster that we're in. Well, I'd like to talk about that more, but we want to talk about one more piece of evidence, and that is, you've mentioned the Royal Navy port of Avaris, and you did an extensive research paper on this. Of course, we can't develop it, but I want to talk about the timing of its abandonment, because according to the archaeology, it's suddenly abandoned. Well, when did that happen? And give us a little taste of the evidence for that.
Sure, Henry. And this goes back to the article that I published in an egyptological journal with no biblical references whatsoever, to make sure that it wouldn't be, blocked out by peer review for mentioning the Bible. I made a case for the abandonment of Avaris during the reign of Amenhotep II, and it goes back to this mass number of burials of animals and people at Avaris during Amenhotep II's reign. And as far as the animals, there are 4 animals mentioned in the Bible at the time of the Passover: sheep, goats, cattle, and dogs. And sure enough, what did the archaeologists find? In the palatial district, that is where the 3 palaces were at Avaris, in that district where you'd never expect animals, there were mass burials of those 4 animals. Sheep and goats the most, and the most of the sheep and goats, they were in their first year of age when they died. One died from a blow to the back of the head, and there was another death between a mother mother and her ewe that died during childbirth. So these amazing deaths of these animals, and you have these mass burials of these animals, all of it is connected to the time of Amenhotep II. How do we know this? The very little pottery evidence that's found in those burials, and Henry, you know how important pottery evidence is. It can date something,
yes.
Relatively speaking. That pottery is pottery that's indicative of pottery of 2 kings, Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. That being the case, usually you date it to the later of the 2. So that would be Amenhotep II. So pottery from his reign is found in those graves of these animals that are buried, the majority of which are sheep and goats, and the majority of which of those are killed or die in their first year of age. So that abandonment, I would connect, Henry, to the time of this debacle in the Sea of Reeds, when the Pharaoh has lost his army. He comes back to Egypt, and he's decimated, and they pretty much clean things up at Avaris and probably just leave that site and kind of consider it ritually impure. And what we know is this: When Amenhotep II came back from Canaan in his first victorious campaign, it says that the first site he went to is Peru-Nefer. That's Avaris. But in the second campaign, it doesn't say that he first stopped at Peru-Nefer. He went to Memphis. So he skipped that stop, that normal place of stopping when a king brings his army back into Egypt. Why? Because it was abandoned. There was nobody there in year 7 in 1446, in November, the year of the Exodus, which occurred in April of that year.
That is phenomenal, Doug. Well, I hate to say it, but we've run out of time, my friend. Thank you for your fidelity and faithfulness to the Bible and your academic excellence and your expertise in all this. We're so grateful you came on the show to share this with the audience. Thank you so much, Doug.
It was my pleasure, Henry. Thank you.
If you're looking to learn more about the Exodus and some of the archaeology related to it, you might enjoy the documentary Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. And actually, ABR's Dr. Bryant Wood is interviewed in it. It shows a bunch of archaeology and stuff about Avaris, that ancient city that's thought to be where the Israelites lived, in addition to a lot of other things. And as of when this podcast was being recorded, it's available to watch on Tubi for free if you have a Roku or something similar. Otherwise, of course, it's available to rent. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.